folks, Josh Knight the First here with another episode of Writer Rebuild, coming to you with episode 40 of the series. Let's get right into it. So this week on Kamen Rider Build, we're seeing the actual debut of Genius Form. We know that we saw the transformation last week, but this week we actually get to find out what it does, and we know it's here to stay because now we're seeing it in the opening. There's still one thing I don't get about the opening, is that we're still seeing Cross Charge, but Cross Charge is long gone. But that question will actually come up a little bit later in the episode as to why we're still tying back to Cross Charge, but enough of that, let's actually talk about Genius Form. So we're shown here at the beginning that Genius Form does have a very noticeable speed advantage over Mad Rogue. Now when Build cranks the little lever there on the side of the belt, we see that he's able to switch between two modes on the belt as far as the Genius Bottle is concerned, as far as using a molecular based attack where he's attacking something on the very base level of Mad Rogue, and then the more physical attack of the left side. Now it would seem that Sento doesn't actually know what the Genius Bottle does for the most part, other than giving him a new form, seeing as it was Katsuragi that built it, not Sento. So it's kind of that weird sort of trade-off between the two of them. One knows something that the other doesn't. Now as far as the design of Genius Form, I actually like it for the most part. I didn't really care for it in the drawings, but then once we actually saw it in form, it looks a lot better, and that happens pretty much every year with Kamen Rider. Now as far as the colorization on the suit, that goes into the kind of color theory of the last couple of years of Kamen Rider, where if you're dealing with forms that are very much color-based, saying that one color has one power and another color has another power, it just makes sense that all the colors mean all the powers. Now as far as Evil is concerned for this episode, we see that again he's sitting out, not actually getting involved. He's just kind of skirting in at the end of battles and then running off, which means probably that he's a little bit scared, I hope, or he's still biding his time for some bigger plan that he has in mind. Now his focus for this episode are these lost bottles, which we see that the Hokuto trio had a couple of them, or really 3 of them. Now the focus of Evil in this episode is to get back these lost bottles, which we find out are man-made and kind of mimic the effects of the Pandora's box at the beginning of the series, where a person exposed to this will become much more aggressive and much more easy to manipulate. Now of course this goes along with Evil's plans as we've seen up until now perfectly. If he can manipulate somebody, he can use them. But the question is just exactly why does he want these bottles? Now for the better part of this episode, we see that Kazumi is noticeably in a funk. Now that makes sense because these bottles that he was holding on to for the longest time are some of the last things that he has to remember the Hokuto trio by, aside from their dog tags. And so to that end, his purpose in the episode is to go ahead and get that back because he's still fighting for home. Or is he? He actually has a conversation with Sento later on in the episode saying he's doing all of this fighting, but at this point he doesn't know why. Because of allegiances being changed, because of the problems with the different countries warring there within Japan, he doesn't exactly know why he's doing this. And admittedly, that makes sense. He's been trying to be the person that's been the most upfront about what they're feeling and pushing forward, and I've noted that in several episodes, that he's been a very upfront kind of guy. But here in this episode, it's getting to the point where he can't sustain that. He needs to know what he's fighting for. He needs that reminder, so it makes sense that his character would naturally doubt that. Now that makes sense for his character, but there's some things happening in this episode that don't make sense for the character, namely Gentoku. For whatever reason, we know that he was defeated by Mad Rogue last week, but this episode, he's the comic relief and we don't know why. He's dressing very flamboyantly, very oddly for his character, since naturally he's always been in his sort of military state uniform for the most part. But here in this episode, he's dressing just kind of weird, and Misora is easily able to call him out on this, because yes, it's very much out of character for him, and we're never given an excuse, he's just kind of doing it. It's not the same thing as other weeks when we see that usually either Kazumi or Ryuga is the source of the comic relief, where usually it's tied to something in their character. For Gentoku, it just being out of character for him to dress weirdly, yeah, that's one thing, but there's no real payoff, at least in my opinion. So that covers most of our base writers, but we still need to deal with Sento. So I know last week I talked about how now Sento and Katsuragi are one and the same, but apparently the show wanted to prove me wrong this week by proving that Sento is in fact in control again, that's the dominant personality, but Katsuragi is somewhere in Sento's head, talking to him and giving him advice and guidance about what to do about this particular part of the story. Now in that sense, it's not too dissimilar from Kamen Rider Double, wherein Shotaro is the main body once they've transformed into Kamen Rider Double, but Philip is there in his head. Except in that case, it's actually 2 people, but here it's the same person, so really, when you think about it, Sento's talking to himself. Now in these conversations with Katsuragi, Sento finds out that the information that he needs for the lost bottles had something to do with Katsuragi's father, rather his father. Now, in looking for his notes, he has to go back to Hokuto and try and dig up any sort of information that he can, and during this time this is an excuse for Kazumi to go off and get into more trouble, but we'll focus on that in a second. We're seeing here that Katsuragi's dad actually had more going on than we realized, seeing that he was actually the one responsible for the creation of the lost bottles in the first place. In looking through his dad's notes, we find that Sento came across a photograph that really shouldn't be there. Now, the woman in this photograph is Reika Kine, who some of you might remember all the way back from episode 3 when our characters had to get smuggled into Hokuto early on in the story. Now, this photo doesn't make sense for several reasons that are brought up there in the episode, in that there's a guardian there in the picture, but guardians have only been around for 5 years, and Sento's dad has been dead for about 10, so that photo is kind of anachronistic unless it was taken recently, which doesn't make sense as to why it would be in his father's notes. Now, we'll get to the payoff for that at the end of the episode because yes, it's very much worth waiting for, but it's interesting things to bring up here in the show, in that the overall show of Build has been very good about tying back all of these little things, like with Nabashima earlier on in the show, whereas he would just be an enforcer character and then we'd be done with him in some other series. They actually tied him back into the plot later on in subsequent episodes, and we see that's actually happening here in this episode. Now, getting back to Kazumi, we see that he did have his reasons for coming back to Hokuto, since yes, this is his portion of the land that he's used to, this is his homeland, but unfortunately he just couldn't keep to himself and actually tried to sneak back into a Faust base, or Nanba base at this point. And we see that unfortunately he got himself captured again and subjected to more nebula gas infusion, which means that now he's on the same footing that both the Hell Brothers and the Hokuto Trio were at, in that if he gets defeated in battle one more time, he's dead. Now, if you look at it in terms of the story, this makes sense. With everybody getting stronger, both Build and Cross, we needed Grease to actually step up as well in terms of strength. Now, the issue that some people might take with this is that it's an issue of strength being added in name only, and we don't actually visually see him get any sort of new form. Now, you can take that as one of two ways. Either one, Toei was too cheap to make a new suit for him, or two, it's actually a throwback to older series where the writer just gets stronger as the story necessitates and we don't need any sort of extra toy or power-up. Although as far as toys go, he does get an extra twin breaker, which either makes it now a twin breaker or a double twin breaker. I'm not sure what the verbiage is on that, but it's still kind of cheap to look at. In any case, armed with this new power-up, we see that Build and Grease are going up against Mad Rogue and a lost match that unfortunately has been made from Prime Minister Tajimi, who is the head of state there in Hokuto. Now, we haven't seen her for several episodes when the whole invasion there of Hokuto happened several episodes back, so we see now that she's been experimented on and really held captive probably by Nanba Heavy Industries this whole time, which means that yes, it's another war crime you can add to their list. Now, during the course of the fight, we see that unfortunately Kazumi is mortally wounded by Mad Rogue, and it looks like he's about to fade away Infinity War style, much like we saw with the Hokuto Trio. But instead of giving in, he actually uses the Dragon Slash Jelly that Ryuga gave him earlier in the episode to go ahead and strengthen his resolve and actually take in all that extra energy that he has, which again arms him with that new twin breaker that he's got on the other arm. The thing about this that I don't get is, I thought the Dragon Slash Jelly was destroyed in order to create the new bottle that Ryuga ended up using. So how did Ryuga get that back? Now, if you're not hung up over that, that's fine. It just means that Grease isn't going to die this week. I really hope they don't kill him off before the end of the series. I really like his character development, and I do hope that he still gets further on development, especially when it comes to Misora. Power-ups aside, we still have to deal with this new smash, which we will leave to Genius Form. Now, it appears that Genius Form does have the ability to nullify the effects of nebula gas, which Sento uses to go ahead and save Prime Minister Tajimi. Now, unfortunately, this power doesn't seem to be utilized beyond that, in that Sento offers to use it for Kazumi to go ahead and cure his effects, but we're going to go ahead and leave that as a power-up for him. Now, what doesn't make sense here is that they tell Prime Minister Tajimi that, look, we understand that you were under these effects, but you're good now, we need you to lead the country, which makes sense since she's the only actual head of state left in the story. The unfortunate thing is that her character is no longer going to be seen in the show because we saw that her actress was actually given her flowers this weekend, meaning this was her last episode, so how does that work? And speaking of things that I'm not sure how they work, we see that Ryuga decided to go ahead and look up Reika, the woman there at the beginning of the episode in the photo, and we see that she actually has a bombshell of information that we weren't expecting. Katsuragi's dad is actually alive. But we're not going to see him this week. We're actually going to find out more about that next week and see just how much he had to do with Project Build and the whole story leading up till now. So yeah, that was information I wasn't really expecting, seeing that they're tying back all of these loose ends from a character you don't really think about from an earlier episode and actually having them relevant to the plot now. And even more so with Katsuragi's dad, the show's been pretty good about deaths being permanent, but we do remember that back at the beginning of the show we were teased with Katsuragi being alive or not being alive, so I guess the same thing applies to his dad. The other mystery that we have to figure out is just exactly what Evil wants with these lost bottles, because we know that he's going to use them in Pandora's box. We see him putting them onto the side panel there and turning them gold, but for some reason they're still using the same effects on people that Pandora's box had at the beginning of the show, so what's the purpose for that if he already has Pandora's box? But these of course are some of the things I've been wondering about. I actually want to ask you guys a couple of questions which you can answer in the comments below, so let's go ahead and talk about a few things. First off, the first fight between Mad Rogue and Build Genius form. When you saw that fight, do you think that Sento's attack actually did something to Mad Rogue, or is it possible that he just didn't know how to use it and it whiffed? Secondly, Grease. Along with his newly found powers, do you think that he also should have gotten a new suit to go with them? And thirdly, Gentoku. Just how much nebula gas did they give him for him to dress in this odd way? You tell me in the comments below. And of course, during the week, you can always talk to me over on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JoshKnight1st. This has been episode 40 of Writer Rebuild for episode 40 of Kamen Rider Build, The Final Revolution. I'm Josh Knight the First. I'll see you guys again next episode.